Hi, everybody. Welcome back. I am super excited today to be talking to the awesome Jason Mankey about his new book, High Priest, all about the life of Raymond Buckland. And Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here today.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad to talk with you. So, Jason, I like to ask everybody right off the bat, were you a 90s witch?
Absolutely. I was a 90s witch. I became a witch in 1994, so definitely in the 90s. And all of the formative books that I read to bring me to that path were definitely 90s era books. Some of them were a little bit older, but they were all the books we were reading in the 90s, including things like The Big Blue Book by Raymond Buckland, Celtic Magic by DJ Conway,
Oh,
of course,
yes.
Silver Raven Wolf to Ride a Silver Broomstick. Very, very much a witch of the 90s. Probably still my favorite decade of being a witch because you could get away with so much more in the age before social media.
Say a little bit more about that. What could you get away with as a 90s witch that you can't get
I
away with
was
today?
I was just young and dumb and part of college pagan student groups, right? So,
Sure. Yep.
we got into hijinks and there are no pictures of those. There's no pictures of me dancing naked to the YMCA in my bedroom with 30 other
Yeah.
people. That's good. That's a good thing.
Good, good. Yeah, I mean, I loved being a 90s witch too, hence the podcast. But yeah, so, well, Jason, you were talking about your favorite books. Did you have a favorite book? I'm sure you loved Bucky's Blue Book. And for anybody who is not aware of what Bucky's Blue Book is, it's one of Raymond Buckland's most famous books, the complete book of witchcraft. Other than that book, did you have a favorite book?
I think Buckland's Big Book of Witchcraft is the most recognizable of all the books
Hmm.
of that kind of era. But I think my favorite still is To Ride a Silver Broomstick, at least when I was
Okay.
up and coming. And I say that because I felt like she was the first person, Silver Ravenwolf, to really write for Gen X and to
Yes.
some extent of early millennials, which would also would be older millennials, but the first millennials. And everybody else was really a boomer, right? And I think that they were
Hmm.
writing for that audience for the most part. So I really appreciated Silver because it just felt younger and fresher, the voice that she wrote with.
I totally agree. And as what is now called a geriatric millennial, I definitely also was strongly influenced by Silver Ravenwolf when I was a teenager because, yeah, she was really speaking in a voice that translated well, I think, to younger generations and also allowed people to pick up a practice much easier than some of the other books that had more, maybe expectations around ritual and certain things. But wonderful. Yeah, that's you don't hear many people mention Silver Ravenwolf these days, but I still have a real soft spot in my heart for Silver Ravenwolf. I really just think that she really did some trailblazing for us.
I really think that one of the reasons we don't hear a lot about her, I think some of it's misogyny, because if you look at a
Yeah.
lot of the other authors of that era, they were all men. like
Yeah.
like Raymond Buckland, whose biography I just wrote. And also she was just so successful in the 90s. And I think there was this little bit of resentment towards her for
I
being
agree.
that successful. She, still does things and she sells candles and I bought some candles from her. I think it was during the pandemic and she wrote love your work and then signed it and I just kept that forever. I was like, "Oh my God, Silver Ravenwolf knows who I am."
Oh, I
Yeah.
know. What a hug
Deal.
from the past or something, right?
Yeah.
Like I've totally felt that a few times too with the guests I've had on here. Jason, what was it like for you as a 90s witch beyond not having social media, being able to get away with a lot more? What was the process of discovering and becoming, did you become a witch in the 90s?
Yes. So I think it was a lot harder back then because you really had to stumble into it in some sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't like see a post from your friend on social media and like, what is that? Maybe I should get involved with that or Google it anywhere, right? So when I started in 1994, I had just happened to pick up Celtic Magic by DJ Conway. And I
Yep.
picked it up not because I was interested in witchcraft, but because I'm a huge Led Zeppelin fan and the lead singer of Led Zeppelin, Robert Plant, loves Celtic mythology. So I
Oh,
felt like I
okay.
could learn about Celtic mythology through this book. And my love of Zeppelin would increase even more because I would understand Zeppelin better. But instead, that book is really just a Wicca 101 book. And I fell
Yep.
in love with the craft. And I remember it felt like a whirlwind 48 hours reading that book and then saying my first prayer to Goddess It was a big deal.
Yeah.
It was life changing, and I could kind of feel that energy. And then I was a solitary for several years. I really didn't know any other witches. I went to Southeast Missouri State University at the time, and people that I knew saw this interest that I had, and every once in a while someone would say, "Oh yeah, that's what I do too." But it never evolved into us talking about it or doing anything together. And then the next time I would see them, they wouldn't mention it at all. So it was a really strange, solitary existence. And then I moved to Michigan and I began meeting other witches and pagans through Michigan State University. And I joined the student group at Michigan State, which is where a lot of those hijinks came in, and I'm glad there was
Hmm.
social media for a lot of it. But not only were we a group with a lot of students, we were also a group with a lot of people just in the community because there really weren't other outlets for pagans in Lansing and East Lansing, Michigan.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, then my like world was not just being a solitary anymore, and I started doing group ritual with other people. And I think it was 24, which to an 18-year-old sounds really old, but it's really not that old,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? I think maybe I was 23 when I started in that group. But the point is, like I had more experience than everybody else without having more experience, and I got to learn how to write ritual with that group and like lead ritual and things. It was really kind of the start of all of the writing and everything else. So yeah, so like my 90s witchcraft had these different phases, the solitary phase and then the group phase. So I got
And
to
then did you
experience it
connect
all.
in because you're a Gardnerian High Priest, correct?
I am a Gardnerian now, yes. Not then though.
Yeah, so when did that connect? Was that also in the 90s that you discovered the Gardnerian group? Did it go from solitaire to college group to meeting coven?
No, I mean, I knew what it was because I loved history. So, I mean, I was reading every witchcraft history book. Living in a university town, I had access to some scholarly materials. My all-time favorite witchcraft book, which is not a how-to book, is Triumph of the Moon by Ronald Hutton. And
Oh,
that came
yes.
out in 1999, so really towards the tail end of the decade. So I was all exposed to that and I knew what Gardnerian was, but I did not become an initiated Gardnerian until 2010 and didn't
Okay.
start really looking into it until maybe 2007. So it took a long time to get there. And I'm happy it did because one of the things about being an eclectic is you really
Hmm.
have to learn how to do things on your own.
I
There's
would
nobody
agree.
there to ask questions, there's no one there to tell you how to do it. You just kind of have to muddle through it. And I think that's a really great learning experience.
I would agree. I had a lot of that same similar learning experience, although it sounds like we have something in common because a big part of my early witchcraft journey also happened in Michigan.
Yeah.
Traverse City,
Oh,
Michigan.
yeah.
And that's where I kind of very accidentally ran into the first witch that I had ever met. And she's still a really close friend and practical family member of mine. And, but yeah, also started in Michigan. Michigan is a secret witch country, I think. Yeah.
Well, I get to travel a lot as a witch now and speak at various festivals and stuff. And when people ask me where do most witches live, people usually think of the coasts, right? Because there can
Right.
be very loud. But I think more witches are in the South and the Midwest than anywhere else. And that's
I would
really the
agree.
witch belt now. I think witchcraft gives us control over circumstances and situations, and it has been a very tumultuous 12 years. And
Indeed.
I think people are looking for answers, and I think they find them in the craft. And I think people who live in repressed areas really need help and answers, and I think they find it in witchcraft.
Yeah, I think that that's really accurate. And I also just want to go back a little bit even to Celtic magic because that was one of my early books as well. And
So
the
bad.
reason I want to bring it up is because those books for people today where, well, there's books everywhere these days, not only on witchcraft, but on everything. And it's self-published and published through, publishing houses and everything else. But back then, those books like Celtic magic were 4.99 and they were full books, right? They weren't skimpy. They were kind of little size, but they were full books and they were 4.99 and I could afford them. Those were like a lifeline for me when I was young in the craft.
My copy of Celtic Magic was only 3.99 in
Oh my gosh.
1994. It felt like
I'd already hit inflation apparently.
yeah,
Yeah.
like yeah, and also they were really inexpensive. You found them on like paperback book rack spinners. They don't even
Yeah,
really make books in that size anymore because they want to charge more for books.
that's right.
One of the other things about something like Celtic Magic is it just wasn't very good as a book. But
Yeah,
DJ
yeah,
Conway was a
yeah.
very, very talented writer, though. So
Hmm.
while the information about Celtic stuff was not particularly accurate, and I don't think she was trying to, be inaccurate. It's just there weren't a lot of resources and materials to draw upon back then, right? And
Right.
everybody really thought Wicca was 8,000 years old or whatever else, right? So, but now you look at it and you're like, well, you should know better. But people just didn't really know better back then about a lot
No.
of historical things.
So let's speak a little bit about not knowing better and being a witchcraft author, and let's talk a little bit about Raymond Buckland. Yeah.
Uh, if if I had known better, maybe I wouldn't be a witchcraft writer. I don't know.
Yeah. And I only say that not because I feel like there's a whole bunch of discrepancies or inaccuracies necessarily or anything like that with Raymond Buckland, but he was already kind of a prolific author by the time we hit the 90s. And then I feel like he had a huge influence on the 90s and the practice of witchcraft in that decade. And so, can you share a little bit about Raymond Buckland's impact and influence, and particularly as it started to bubble up in the 90s?
Ray was one of the first public witches writing books about witchcraft. If you go back and you look at the 60s, there really weren't a whole lot of witchcraft books that were available. And a lot of the ones that were being written by the end of the decade were written by outsiders. Hans
Uh-huh.
Holzer wrote a whole host of these kind of paperbacks. And then in the late 60s, I think you have Sybil Leek, Diary of a Witch, but none of these books really tell you how to do witchcraft, which
Right.
was, it was more like we're just going to regurgitate this history. So Raymond Buckland started writing in like 66. He wrote a little pamphlet for his museum. And then by 1970, he really starts writing magical books. He writes The Truth About Witchcraft, which is a lot like some of those earlier witchcraft books, and it doesn't really tell you how to do witchcraft. It just
Yeah.
says, oh, this is the history of witches. And he makes veiled snipes at Alex and Maxine Sanders and Sybil in that book. And but later in 1970 he releases Practical Candle Burning Rituals,
Hmm.
which was a book of spells, right? It's all candle spells, and he wrote it to have spells from the old religion, which would be pagan, and then the new religion, so it has psalms, so it appealed to a pretty wide audience. When I was at Llewellyn researching this biography of Ray and going through some old Llewellyn papers and stuff, and Sandra Weschke, whose husband Carl Weschke
Ah.
was the president and founder of sort of modern Llewellyn. They'd been around for a long time, but he bought the company and he pushed them into doing witchcraft books. She said, practical candle burning rituals. That kept us in business for quite a while. So that was a really successful book for Ray. But it was 1986 with the Big Blue Book that came out that he's probably most remembered for today. That book evolved out of a study course that he had done for his own tradition, CX Wicca, but
Hmm.
nothing had ever been published like this before. It had like the study questions at the end. It really felt like a workbook for school, but about
Yeah.
witchcraft.
Yep.
And when you look at it, you can't help but take the subject seriously, right? Because it feels
Yeah.
like Ray is very serious. And he's so serious, he tells you how to make an athame on your stove and how to build an altar out of wood. And you're like, what is this, shop class? But it had all this information in it. And as I said, it came out in 86. And there really were only maybe 4 or 5 books that were this detailed. And even then, none of those tell you how to make your own athame. You had Starhawk's Spiral
Right.
Dance. You have Mastering Witchcraft by Paul Hewson, which is a really very different book in a lot of ways. And then you had The Big Blue Book, right? And when you went witchcraft book shopping, that was the title that just jumped out at you because it was so different than everything else. I mean, the dimensions of the book are different than everything else. The layout of the book is different than everything else. It has that very recognizable cover with the color blue and the big pentagram on it. And if you were a witch growing up in the 90s, that was one of the three books that you read. It was like,
Yes.
what have you read? I've read Wicca by Scott Cunningham. I've read The Big Blue Book. And I've probably also read To Ride a Silver Broomstick, or perhaps I've read The Spiral Dance by Starhawk. Those were the big books, right? And today we have thousands of books, and everybody reads lots of different things. And a witchcraft book that sells 10,000 copies is a pretty big seller in today's world of witchcraft books. But back then, there were only like 15 books. So they all sold a lot more, especially things like Buckland. So we all had this sort of one space that we drew upon. We could all talk about Bucky's Big Blue Book and, you know, whether or not we'd actually made the robe that he says you should make in the Big Blue
Hmm.
Book, right? Now, as I said, there are thousands of books and everybody comes from different places. But before that, it was just 10 things, and Bucky was one of those 10 things.
And like you said, he had already published several books beforehand. Not all of them were instructive. There was practical candle burning rituals, or yeah, is it
Hmm?
rituals? Practical candle burning rituals.
Yes, I think so.
And yeah, and so I remember, riding my bike to a half price books, right? And discovering that big blue book. And one of the reasons it appealed to me so much is kind of what you're talking about now, is that it was in depth. It took it seriously. It was a course of training. It taught you how to do everything. It was very focused on commitment, really, in many ways. It was like having this book was like the how-to guide, and it wasn't the easy how-to guide.
Oh,
It was not the easy how-to guide. It was like, here is how you do everything step by step in this book. And it really appealed to me. I'm still a little bit like that. Like I'm a teacher and I love being a student. And I'm like, oh yeah, give me the study questions, give me all the things, right? And so I
mhm.
love stuff like that even today. And maybe the Big Blue Book had a huge influence on me because of that. Um, but one of the things that I also remember about the Big Blue Book is that, and it's one of my favorite things to bring up, is that there's some point in it, I don't remember what page it's on, but he basically is talking about why you should never do a person-specific love spell and why
Mhm.
that's not something that, witches, I don't know if he was using the word Wiccan, and I want to kind of get to that in a moment too, but why witches won't do person specific love spells. But just so you know how it's done, here's the step by step instructions for a person specific poppet love spell. And that's one of my favorite moments in that book. And it makes me wonder if there aren't other sort of, they're not quite blinds, but I wonder if you know of any other things in that book that were sort of like, well, I'm not really supposed to talk about this, but I'm going to talk about this sort of a thing.
He took his oaths. He was a Gardnerian. He was the first Gardnerian in the United States, and he took those oaths very seriously. And one of the things he was most proud of was he never revealed anything about the traditions in any of his published books. So I don't really think that there are a whole lot of blinds in it. I think he knew what people were interested in, though,
Sure.
right? And was going to put that in his books. But he was a big believer in that idea of the law of three. And I actually think he made it
Mm.
up as we know
Oh,
it today. So when we talk about the law of three, everything that you do comes back to you threefold in this lifetime. And it's an idea that comes from Gerald Gardner's fiction book, High Magic's Aid, which was published in 1949. And in High Magic's Aid, one of the characters says, if somebody does good to you, you should return that good threefold. That's all
oh.
she says. Buckland in the late 60s starts talking to magazines, and he's like, witches obey the rule of three, that whatever we do comes back to us three times in this lifetime, which was not what that sentence said at all, right? I mean, it had nothing to do with bad things coming back at you or
Mhm.
necessarily that if you did good, you would have good come to you. And so Buckland begins articulating this idea and it becomes a part of all of his books, like 1970s Witchcraft from the Inside, which was,
Right.
one of his first witch books. So yeah, he's really responsible for that, and he took that very, very seriously. It was his tenet, and he took that rule seriously. So he never really wanted to do anything that might result in something bad coming his way.
That is so interesting. I had never heard that Buckland might be the one that really promoted, especially in the United States, this idea of a karmic law of three, so to speak, for the magic that witches were doing. That's really
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, that's, just one of the many great revelations in High Priest, my
Yeah.
biography of Raymond Buckland. Yeah, but I mean, it's really interesting because, I've read all the older material and it's not there. And then all of a sudden I'm reading, you know, magazine articles with him in the late 60s and there it is and there it shows up. And then you begin to see it repeated. And again, it's that power of there are only 5 books that are published about this, right?
That's
So
right. You're setting the
everybody's
standard.
yeah, everybody's reading the same books and oh, that this is a thing, right? So then
Yeah.
it gets put in every book. Yeah.
And so this
Buckland.
also kind
Yeah.
of, oh, what are you going to say?
Also, one of the other things Buckland did was he popularized the names of the Irish Celtic Sabbats, Beltane, Lunasa,
Oh,
Samhain, and Imbolc. He wasn't the first person to use them, but if you go back and you read all this stuff from the 60s and 70s, it's really garbled. Like one of Lady Sheba's books, she published a book of shadows. She didn't write it. She like dumped it to Llewellyn and they published it. She calls the autumn equinox Samhain, for example. Like this
interesting.
idea that the wheel of the year was this thing that was set in stone pretty early on with names really wasn't true. And it really took until the mid 70s for everybody to kind of decide what we're going to call everything. And Buckland was one of the people who used those Irish Celtic names. And I think him putting it in print really had a lot of influence on the fact that we use those names today.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it seems like that they were always kind of in use. But now that you say that, I mean, that makes sense. I think the earlier names that I saw from Gardner and Valiente were like May Eve and Halloween. They even called it, or
Right.
Hallows
Yeah.
Eve, and
Hmm.
yeah, all of those things. So yeah, that's really fascinating. I never knew that Buckland was such the promoter. I know that Aidan Kelly had a strong hand in naming some of the Sabbats, but I didn't realize that
Absolutely.
Buckland was probably the one who really promoted that, especially if he wrote that, and I'm pretty sure he did in the Big Blue Book.
Yeah, it's definitely in Big Blue. It's in the Tree first, though, which is his Saxon Witchcraft, Seax Wicca book. And that's an interesting book in that it's full of rituals. It doesn't tell you sort of why things work or how to do things. It reads more like a script, right? Here are the rituals. Good luck with them. I won't tell you how to do them or what any of it means, but good luck. But even in the 70s, just having rituals was a big deal because there really
Yeah.
weren't any published rituals until 1970, 1971.
And really, it was kind of just in the format of a book of shadows, right? If you were ever to get a hold of a book of shadows or even a grimoire, possibly, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't always come with explanations. It's sort of like, here's the invocations, here's the rituals, here's the spirits, the deities. There you go. That's it. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Good
Yeah.
luck. Good luck. Here's some stuff.
Yeah.
Practice
And
well.
so this
Yeah.
this does make me think though, because I had talked to another guest on here who mentioned something really interesting that Raymond Buckland had said that the Big Blue Book was one of his biggest regrets. Did you ever hear about anything like that?
Oh no. No, he was tickled by how much people liked it. He was appreciative when people called it, the Big Blue Book and Uncle Bucky's Big Blue Book. He loved all of that. He has an unpublished memoir that helped me write his biography that'll never see print just because it really was never finished. But he talks about, how he loves the little fun nicknames. I don't think there's any regrets with that book at all. And
The only thing that I had heard in terms of regrets was simply because of the nature of publishing at the time. And I had heard, and so all of this is just hearsay, I suppose, but I had just heard that they were also trying to really get him to publish Big Blue as the complete book of Wicca, especially with two C's being used, and really trying to push the idea of Wicca with two C's,
yeah,
and that Raymond Buckland was pushing up against that. Um, because what I'm starting to suss out, both from my own research and in interviewing people, is that the witchcraft to Wicca pipeline, shall we say, or using that new term, was still really kind of contentious. We're talking 60s, 70s, 80s, and it wasn't really until the maybe late 80s and 90s that these two words were starting to be used synonymously in some ways. Do you know about his relationship with any of that, or the words Wicca versus witchcraft, or Wicca with one C versus two C's?
so the person who said that was kind of right because there were a lot of different names that were thought of for the Big Blue Book. Like they didn't exactly know what to call it. I got to see a bunch of Llewellyn's production notes while that book was being put together, and I got to see Ray's letters to Carl Weschke when they were finalizing everything. And it was almost named Wicca, which would have been a really big deal because for Ray, what he did was witchcraft. Witchcraft was a religion. Today, it's not popular to say that witchcraft is a religion, and
No.
people will rake you over the coals for it. But for 40 years, when we think of the history of the modern craft, people would say witchcraft is a religion. This is my
Yes.
religion. This is what I do. And that was really important to Ray. It was one of the things that he held on to his whole life. Witchcraft is a religion, and it is my religion. And in his early books, he uses Wicca a little bit, but he uses it with one C. When it's used that way, it almost means like wise ones. It's almost like a title for people within witchcraft. Oh, they were the Wicca. They were the wise ones. And I think Llewellyn really wanted to move towards the word Wicca in some ways because of the Satanic Panic at the time, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that there was a lot of fear about just using the word witch because it's such a loaded word. It's such a loaded word. And so is the word witchcraft. And they were looking for something that was a little bit different than that. And then in 89, they got Scott Cunningham to put Wicca on the title of a
Yeah.
book, The Solitary Practitioner. But it was almost Ray. There is a notebook of Ray's that he used when he was writing the Big Blue Book. And if you go to the Buckland Museum in Cleveland, Ohio, it's put in a plexiglass case, right? Because it was his early version of Big Blue. And there is the word Wicca like on the outside of the notebook. But his
Mm.
letters make it very clear that he did not want to call it that. He did not want to call the book Wicca. He wanted to call it witchcraft because that's what it was to Ray.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And so, Jason, can you share a little bit, kind of in the same vein, can you share a little bit about the story, the history of Buckland bringing witchcraft slash Wicca to the United States? Like, because that changed a lot, and not just because Raymond brought it, but that was such a pivotal time where Wicca slash witchcraft just began to bubble over, so to speak, so and change in so many dramatic ways. Can you tell a little bit about that story?
So Raymond Buckland was born in England and he moves to the United States in 1962 and his wife and their two sons come a couple of months later also in 62. And in 62 he gets interested in witchcraft. And at the time if you were interested in witchcraft, there was only one person to write to and he just happened to own a museum. So you could write to Gerald Gardner and then he
Mm-hmm.
may or may not write back to you. And what he writes back to you probably won't have much meaning in your life because his letters are like a paragraph long, full of weird typing mistakes. So strange. But Buckland is interested in witchcraft. And at the time, if you wanted to be a witch, like Gerald Gardner, the only way to do so was to be initiated. Again, there were no 101 books, there were no ritual scripts that were being published. I am sure that there were people in the United States practicing some sort of witchcraft, which they might have called it back then, or maybe they would call it now witchcraft in hindsight, but they weren't public and there was no way to get in touch with them. So Buckland writes to Gerald Gardner, and Gerald writes him back, and then he doesn't hear anything. He doesn't hear anything. And then a woman named Monique Wilson,
Mm-hmm.
whose witch name is Olwen, writes back and she goes, I am writing for Gerald Gardner. I am his high priestess, and all of your correspondence will be through me. Monique
Okay,
is a
Monique.
fascinating character. She was definitely very full of herself in some ways. And so they begin a correspondence. At first, it's very strained. You know, he's like, I want to be a witch so bad. And she's like, well, if you're going to be a witch, you have to have a working partner. Because at the time, they were in a lot of covens bringing people in, male, female at the same time. And he doesn't have a working partner. And then his wife gets interested in it. So all of a sudden, they have a working partner. Monique starts talking about a person named Robin from California who might be her first American initiate. And then Ray
Hmm.
would have to go to meet Robin and get initiated. And then Robin, this thing falls through. I don't know. what happens to Robin? All of a sudden, they're like a footnote in history. And then Monique's like, I know it's going to be tough for Rosemary, but she's going to have to be the High Priestess of North America. You guys need to come over here and get initiated. And, they don't have a lot of money, the Bucklands in 1963. And they've got two kids, and, they've been in the country for a year, right? So there's not a ton of savings. But Ray, who works at British Airways, does get a discount on flying. And
Okay.
he writes to Monique, I think I could come over, but I can't, not both of us, but I could come over. And Monique goes, that is lovely. We'll make do with this and we'll teach you witchcraft and we'll initiate you. And at the time, you didn't just have to be initiated, you had to be elevated to the second and third degrees in order to
Hmm.
make other witches. And so Ray goes over there and he's there for 10 days. It's a very short trip. And he goes through all of these initiations and elevations. And then he leaves and he gets back and he elevates and initiates his wife. And then a couple of weeks later, they're initiating their first witches in January of 1964. And we have
Wow.
America's first documented witch coven. I don't like, like history is very contentious. And there are a lot
Yes.
of, yes. And so I'm always trying to parse my words carefully. But, Guard or Buckland's Witchcraft Coven is the first one we can say definitively this existed and they called themselves witches. And by April, he had initiated 8 more people. So there were a coven of 10 witches in the New York City area by 1964. That's kind of how the story of how Buckland got initiated. It was just letter writing, and then all of a sudden it escalates with Monique because I think that they really wanted to get a foothold in North America and make the
Hmm.
craft available for people here. And at the time, of course, they believed that you had to be initiated to do it.
Hmm.
And Ray, in his letters to the Wilsons, her husband Scotty was also a witch. He makes it clear that he's very sincere about this. Rosemary writes some letters herself, and you can see that this is something that they want to do. And I think Monique, she could see that too, and thought they would be good ambassadors for the craft. Also at the time, and this is kind of funny, and I allude to it in the book, but I can't say it like definitively because we don't know definitively. But at the time, if you were going through writing these letters to famous witches and you were being considered for initiation, they often wanted your picture. And a lot of that is because Gerald Gardner always thought that if he was going to promote the craft, the best way would not be for him to promote it, but for attractive younger high priestesses to promote the craft. So Ray puts a picture in, and then when Rosemary gets interested, he includes her picture in a letter, and Monique writes back at one point. Rosemary's picture causes quite the stir among the male witches in the coven, just like your picture caused quite a stir among the female witches
Oh
in the
boy.
coven, which I think is really funny, right, to look at it, read it
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
But it was important that, whoever they initiated was younger and attractive. And Ray and Rosemary fit that bill.
So interesting. And so that is, and just to make sure, because this is also a bit of history where I love witch, especially modern witchcraft history myself, but this is a point where I feel like it does get a little fuzzy. But with Raymond Buckland and Rosemary Buckland, were they like ground zero for, well, let's just say Gardnerian witchcraft in the United States?
They were absolutely the first Gardnerian witches in the United States that we could say definitively practice the Gardnerian craft. There are stories of other people in North America who might have been Gardnerian witches. There's a tradition out here on the West Coast that might have been influenced by the people who initiated Gardner in the 1930s,
Okay,
if you
yeah.
believe Gardner was initiated, but that's not quite the same thing as being Gardnerian. And
Yes, yes.
there are talks of, like, one of Gardner's initiates did move to Canada and was there in the early 60s. But as far as we know, she didn't initiate anybody or start a coven during that time. So Ray was really the first Ray and Rosemary were the first Gardnerians in North America, the United States. And some of the first practicing witches, as again I said, certainly possible there were other witches before, and I'm not discounting those stories, but here we have a real paper trail, and we know that it
Right.
happened.
Right. And so when he came and he and Rosemary are bringing Wicca, bringing Gardnerian craft to the United States, and it just starts growing and growing and growing. It seems to me almost exponentially once they were off and running as a coven that Wicca and witchcraft just started taking off in the United States. What would you say, especially around, the 90's and with Big Blue, it was obvious that Buckland was already ahead of the curve when it came to uh, not either maybe not needing a coven or not even needing initiation in order to start practicing witchcraft or starting to practice Wicca. Where did that, like, was he just so ahead of the curve? Was that part of the young heart marketing for witchcraft scheme? Do you know what I mean? Like, where did that kind of come in for him?
Some of it might have been the result of leaving the Gardnerian craft in
Mm-hmm.
1972, 73. So he and Rosemary lead a coven in New York for 10 years and initiate a little under 40 witches during that time. But during this time, like witchcraft is going through a boom period. There are witches who are not Gardnerian who are coming forward. So there's a lot of witches in the United States. When I say a lot, probably a couple thousand. One of the things now is we take for granted how many of us there are. Back then,
Absolutely.
it was still like the numbers were really small. But he and Rosemary get divorced, and then he has a falling out with the coven that he started. So once they got divorced, they had to no longer be the high priest and high priestess because it was thought, you had to have that matched pair. So
Mm-hmm.
they give the coven to another couple. And Ray and that other couple have a huge falling out, and it like they hate each other, and you can
Wow.
read them being mean to each other in like the green egg letter columns from the mid 70s and things. I mean, it
Yes, yes,
was
yes.
very public feud in a lot of ways, but because Ray was not in the Gardnerian tradition really, he wasn't in a position to practice at the time because now he's flying solo. He decides maybe I'll start my own witchcraft tradition. And he kind of draws upon what he'd learned as a guard, but he also sort of sees what's going on around him in the New York area and around the country, that there are more witches and they really want to practice the craft. And if you had to wait for a Gardnerian initiation, you're going to be waiting a long time in a lot of places. Maybe there's a different way to do this. So in 1974, in his book, The Tree, the Saxon Witchcraft book, he has a self-dedication ritual for this new tradition. And he says that this ritual is equal to an initiation ritual and that you are a full CX Wicca witch if you do this. It's no different than being initiated into a coven. So in 1974, that was a pretty big deal
Yeah.
because there was still a lot of people who disagreed with that. I remember growing up in the 90's, every once in a while I would run into witches and they'd be like, well, who initiated you? And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
the gods. I didn't,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't
Yep.
part of a lineage tradition or whatever. And there was still a lot of scoffing, right? Like, oh, well, you're really
Mm-hmm.
a witch. Today I don't really think that exists so much. But even up until the 90's, that was still a way that people thought. So, and if you look back and you read Ray's earlier stuff from like 1970, 71, it's clear that he still felt that way about being a witch, that you had to be initiated,
Yeah.
and then it churns. And I think a lot of that turn had to do with leaving the tradition, but also just being sympathetic to what was going on. I mean, early Wicca too was extremely homophobic. Part of
Yeah.
that was Gardner, this real emphasis on male female polarity. But Buckland had gay friends by the early 70's, and he began to realize that too was an antiquated thing within Wicca and it needed to be done with, right? And there needed to be a place for everybody in the craft. So
Yeah.
that period, 70, 74, 75, was really important to him because it really changed a lot of perceptions. And then I think once Ray's perceptions changed, there were other people who were willing to come to those same conclusions, which were overdue, I think.
Yeah, such a pioneer in so many ways, in ways that I didn't even realize about Raymond Buckland. One of the things that I noticed when I was looking up, his list of books, he is such a prolific author, and it's really kind of interesting to me, is that it seemed like that he published quite a few books all the way up through the 80s. And then there were only like a couple of books in the 90s. It was like Buckland's Big Book of Spirits, and I believe one other book that he published in the 90s. And then you get to after 2000 and you start getting like Wicca for one, Witchcraft this, right? And it kind of happens a little bit in the early 2000s. And I thought that was really interesting. Was he just so physically busy in the 90s? Was he just going to festivals? Was he teaching things? Like, what was he doing in the 90s? Because I know he didn't take a break.
I think he was still writing. He was just trying to write different things. So by the end of the 80s, early 90s, he was really trying to write things other than witchcraft books.
Uh
He felt
huh.
like he had said everything that needed to be said in the witchcraft world, which is really incredible because I mean, you could have written a sequel to Big Blue, right? I
Easy.
mean, Cunningham wrote a sequel to Wicca. Silver Ravenwolf wrote two sequels to Ride of Silver Broomstick. So you'd think that he could have done that, and he chose not to, but he wrote about other things. So there's the Big Red Book, which is
Yep.
his spirit communications book. It was actually released first as The Doorways to Other Worlds, and it came out
Hmm.
that way in 94. And but he also like his grandfather was Romany. And so he
Okay.
wrote
Yeah.
a lot of books about Romany magic and spells. All of those books have gypsy in the title, which is a
Yes, they
slur.
do.
We try really hard not to use that, but in the 80s, 90s, it was still a word that was used by a lot of people, even within that community. And that was what was on the cover of those books. So while it feels like he didn't write a book like a lot of books, I think he really still did. They were just not necessarily what we think of with Ray,
Hmm.
because they weren't necessarily witchcraft books. It was really only in the late 80s, early 90s that he became a witchcraft writer full time. Even then,
Interesting.
it still wasn't a very profitable thing to do to be a
Hmm.
witchcraft writer. And he lived in San Diego when the Big Blue Book came out, which is a very expensive place to live. And but by then, though, you had Barnes and Nobles and you had this bigger book buying culture in the United States. And
Yes.
by 92, he could afford to just be a full-time writer, but it took a long time to get there. And he ends up moving to a farm. And maybe that is one of the reasons for a little bit of slower production. But I don't know. When I was going through and doing his bibliography of everything he'd ever written, I mean, that's almost 60 books.
It's a lot of books.
It's a lot of books, and I never really felt like he ever took a break. I mean, it was like all the time. And he wrote a lot of fiction things too. And,
Yes.
a lot of those are never going to be read by witches. A lot of them were kind of vanity presses and they came and they went pretty fast. And even then there were some witchcraft books like that too. Like he by the middle of the 90s, he wanted to put out everything he had ever written because, they needed the income because he's a full-time writer, right? So whatever you can
Right.
get. Yeah. So there's
What
some
was
really
and
weird obscure books
Yes, I
during,
was
during
just
that
trying to
time.
think of the title of one I was just looking at. It was one of his fiction books, and it was about psychic spies and a coup with the US and like everything else going on. And I forget what it was called, but I'm pretty sure that was published in the 90s as well. And I was like, man, I might see if I can find that book.
There's the committee. I think it's probably the
That's what it is.
committee.
It's the
Yeah.
committee. It's the committee. Yes.
It was a weird time for Llewellyn because they were getting into fiction publishing. And Silver Ravenwolf wrote her Witches Chillers series at the same
Yep.
time, which had the characters from the Teen Witch cover as characters. Somebody should still turn that into a TV show. I'm Bethany Salem.
Absolutely.
Bethany Salem for life. And that's the name of the girl on the cover. And then Buckland wrote
Yeah.
the committee. So you had like their big witchcraft names writing these fiction books.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he also ended up writing for Bantam, like which is, a
Yeah.
very respected, mainstream publisher. He had a contract for three books, and only two came out, but they were the Bram Stoker mysteries. So he had, the character, as the guy who wrote Dracula as a character in these books. So they mixed, occult things and Victorian era England, you know. with yeah. So there was that so much stuff that Ray did. It was like so many books.
What was your favorite thing? I mean, obviously, I know you're a Gardnerian High Priest. You like modern witchcraft history, but what was it about Raymond Buckland specifically that made you want to write a book about
Nothing. So Llewellyn asked me if I would write this book. That was it, really. Certainly Ray is somebody that I knew from history, and I actually did meet him once, but it was very fleeting. But Llewellyn wanted to publish a book about Ray. They wanted to publish a biography, and they thought that I would be a good person to write this biography because, as they said, you can write about history and it's not boring, Jason. And there's going to be
them?
so much history in this book, and we want it not to be boring. This was, I think, 2020 is when we started having talks about it, about me writing
Wow.
this book. And I wanted to say no so bad because I knew it'd be a lot of work. And my friends were like, you should totally do this, right? It'll be really great for your career. I'm like, I don't think anything's great for a witchcraft writer's career, but whatever. And
Yeah.
I gave in and I said I would do it, and it was hard because it's so different writing a book like this. And the
Yes.
other nine books that I've written, they've been the stories that I've wanted to tell for the most part, right? Nonfiction books, but like this is how the book is laid out. This is what I want to write about. And when you're writing about somebody else, it's their story, right? I wanted
Hmm.
to tell Ray's story. And that means having to write about little tiny planes for one person that fly at about 4,000 feet because Ray loved flying. He was a gearhead. He loved cars. I had to write about things that I know very, very little about. And you got to kind of jump down these rabbit holes. And then you got to figure out his life. And then you've got to put that life into context. It's a really different way of writing than I had written before. So it was really challenging.
I
And
can believe it.
for me mostly, I mean, what I like to do is I like to read things and know things and then spit them out, right? And with Ray's book, I mean, I really loved reading the letters that he wrote to people, the letters that people wrote back to him, the correspondence between Ray and various people, and I got to see things that I don't think anyone has ever really seen before or written about before, like getting to hold a letter that Gerald Gardner wrote was a pretty
Wow.
big
Yeah.
deal to me.
Hmm.
And I remember when I saw it, I was at the Buckland Museum, and they were like, "Hey, these are things you might want to look at. This might be interesting." And they give me this folder, and I sit down and got my cup of coffee, and then I'm like, "Oh, this is a letter from Gerald Gardner." And I hurriedly took my cup of coffee and put it in another place in the room because I would hate to spill coffee on
Oh,
that
could you
particular thing.
imagine?
That's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's witchcraft history right there. I'm not sure they knew really what they had. So yeah. So nothing made me want to write about Gerald. It's Llewellyn wanted me to write, or sorry, nothing made me want to write about Ray, but Llewellyn wanted me to write about Ray, and I said yes. But I'm really glad that I did it now. I got to meet people that I would have never met before. I got to tell this story, which I'm so excited to have people read it when it comes out in May. You know,
What
yeah.
excites you the
So
most about his story?
one of my favorite parts is when Ray brings Gardnerian craft to the United States and how that unfolded, because it's such a different way of communicating than how you and I communicate today. The fact that they're
Absolutely.
sending these letters back and forth to each other, don't really know a whole lot about each other, and she's like, "Show up on my porch, right? Come to my house, right?" You would never do that today, and
No.
you wouldn't go to somebody's house that way either, right?
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, so that I find really exciting, and then to look at sort of the history of who he initiated and who he came into contact with, and how that decade of the 1960s really helped form the modern witchcraft world. And
Hmm.
I'd probably spend way too much time writing about that and like ignore other parts of his life. But you can't. I didn't want to write a 600-page book because no one
Right.
reads 600-page books really a whole lot anymore. So got to keep it kind of manageable. But I really loved that sort of thing, like finding out the histories. And one of my favorite parts of the book is the history of the Big Blue Book and how that came to be and how people at Llewellyn were like, "This is terrible. You can't print this," and then it goes on to sell 500,000 copies. I found that really interesting.
That is so interesting. Yeah, it seems like the publishing of Big Blue had a lot of back and forth and unknowns and push and pull going on in that. I'm really glad that it made it out into the world. And from what I understand, it continues to be a really good seller. You still see it out at bookstores today. It's similar to Scott Cunningham's Wicca in that years, decades after it was published, it still is selling good copies.
In 2022, 2021, I went to Salem, Massachusetts in 2021. So like my first big trip out of the house post COVID. So it was very exciting to go, and a lot of the stores had rules about how many people could be in at a time, but there were tons of people there. And I went with my friend Thorn Mooney, who's a great
Oh,
witch and a great
yes.
writer. And a lot of it we wanted to look for our books, right, at the bookstores because as authors, you're vain that way, and it's just sort of fun to see your things in the wild. So I'd go and I'd look through all of the witchcraft books at each of the witchcraft stores in Salem, and there were a couple stores that just had like racks of Big Blue.
Wow.
Here's 12 copies of Big Blue out. And any other book might have two or three copies out. That doesn't mean there aren't more in the back, but there was not that demand for 12 copies in a week or whatever. And there was Buckland's book that apparently still had that sort of demand, more so than Cunningham or Ravenwolf, which surprised me. But I think it's just such an interesting package, that book.
Yes.
The Big Blue with its iconic cover and its huge dimensions and stuff. It just commands attention in a way
Yes.
that a lot of other books don't. While I was writing the book, I spent a lot of time talking about Big Blue, and I talked to my wife about it. And she's like, "Yeah, so I've got a Big Blue book, a Big Blue story, Jason." And I was like, "Okay, let me hear it." She goes, "Well, I was sitting downstairs with my parents, and they were watching Cops on TV, and
Okay.
the cops invade a house, and there it was, Big Blue right there.
Oh
And
my
you can't
God.
you can't escape it, right? Like you could look at other books and like maybe that is, maybe that's not, but there's no maybe with Big Blue. She had just checked it out of a local library, and her parents are super Catholic, her stepdad and her mom super Catholic, not happy that my wife is interested in witchcraft, and she just goes up to her bedroom and hides the book because I don't want her to. She doesn't want them to see it. But I mean that's how iconic that book was. It was just everywhere,
Yeah,
for
and
a
it's in a,
period
it's
of
in a
time.
number of different shows. I mean, that cop show sounds like live, but it was also a prop in a number of shows over
Yeah.
the years too, because it is such a commanding and powerful looking even book. Yeah, absolutely. So, Jason, I'm a little curious after this whole conversation. It sounds like, with Raymond Buckland, that he was part of a vision of the future of witchcraft and that he really promoted a vision of the future of witchcraft. And so I kind of want to ask you a little bit, Jason, as a 90s witch, where did you see the craft going in the 90s? Is this kind of like where you saw it going?
Wow, that's a good question. I think social media has changed the equation in a lot
Absolutely.
of ways, and sometimes for the better and sometimes for worse. I think that we're often way too mean to each other online,
Yeah.
and I think that we alienate allies and friends sometimes. Like,
Yeah.
I can't believe you did that, and just we kind of jump at each other right now. And I get it, like these times are really tough and really difficult. And I think we're on more on edge than we've ever been before. But I think social media has really changed things to a degree, that
Yeah.
we don't get along as well as we should, which makes me sad. But it's also amazing that witchcraft is this big thing, right? That we have
Yes.
1,000 witchcraft books every year, that we have hundreds of witchcraft podcasts and outlets for things. I do think we're seeing anybody, I guess, can be a witchcraft influencer now. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I read things that I just don't think are true,
Mm-hmm.
or we're creating an aesthetic that is hard to live up to. Like I
Yeah.
can't, my spells don't look like those pretty spells on Instagram. Like
Yeah.
how do you do this? Like, is this really a spell or is this a photo op? Because,
Especially with those long, gorgeous nails. Like, how do you do it? Like, how do you pick up those things? Yeah. Yeah.
right? And I think that, make creating a standard that's hard to achieve is difficult because I think it gives people kind of a wrong sense. Witchcraft is messy, right? And
Oh
it
yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
always look super nice, and it's still just as effective as anything else. I don't want to sound like the old man like yelling at the clouds on his lawn though, right? I mean, I love young
Yeah.
witches. I love the energy of it and things, and I think a lot of times too we look way too often at older materials, and that includes some of Buckland's
Yes.
material. I was talking to his widow the other day, and even in the 90's, she's like, Ray, I think that sometimes you're just not really up on the times. And what you're writing, is not going to appeal to some people because you need to get with it a little bit more. And I was like, wow, I can't believe you told me that, right? But it's kind of a funny little anecdote. And so I like it. We're always pushing forward, and it's always going to change. And maybe it doesn't change the way that you want it to, but I think for the most part, our trajectory within the witchcraft world has been a good one.
Yeah. And so in light of that, what do you like, and we can rephrase this question a little bit if it doesn't quite make sense, but what do you like more about witchcraft now versus the 90's? Or where do you see as like a positive development?
Even in the 90's, it still felt like this weird, mysterious thing.
Yes.
Right? Like getting tools was still pretty difficult. Going into a store that sold witch stuff, you kind of looked over your shoulder a little bit, like what are people going to say if they know that I'm here? It still felt like this big giant secret. And
Mm.
now when I go into a boutique with my wife, there's a witchcraft book next to the astrology book and the chakra book, right? I mean,
Right.
it's
Right.
so much more in your face. And a lot of people really look down on that, but I think anything that opens doors is a really positive thing. And I
Hmm.
like that there are alternative doors that can be open today, that you don't just have to go to that metaphysical shop or whatever. You could, find it at Hot Topic or Urban Outfitters or wherever it is.
It's something I've definitely joked around about with my friends. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword. Like for me, I'm like, wow, it's really cool that this is so everywhere, but also like being a 90's witch where things were a little bit more difficult, it's also still to me a little jarring walking in like the front doors of Barnes and Noble. And before you even get into the full bookstore, it's like an occult section right there. You've got your palmistry kit, astrology
Yeah.
kit, witchcraft kit, herbal kit, right? Just like all sitting right there. And I'm like, this is very different. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I remember buying my first books in 94, 95, and you would take the book up to the counter and you were
And be
like, they're gonna
scared.
judge me for buying this, right? Like it felt like this is like you had just gone and bought hardcore pornography or something, right? And
Absolutely,
you know,
yes.
and all it was is that you bought Ted Andrews' How to Heal with Color, right? I mean, there was nothing.
Yeah.
It was all so benign, but it still felt like a little taboo. And now it doesn't really feel that way at all.
Yeah, because it was, right? I mean, the 90's still had the satanic panic. It was technically the tail end of it, but that sort of idea was still really prevalent. People were afraid of the occult, of supernatural, of witchcraft, of
Hmm.
these sorts of things, even as they were starting to move in. So there was definitely that level of, oh my gosh, is this person behind the counter a Christian fundy? Are they going to yell at me, right, about this,
Yeah.
and that sort of a thing. Yeah,
And we think of the Satanic Panic as probably being done like in 1988 or whatever, but it was the early 90's with the West Memphis Three when
correct.
those guys were, railroaded into jail just because, they dabbled a little bit in the occult, right? I mean, yeah, it was a scary time in a lot of ways, and I don't think people today who are younger really understand, that people lost jobs, they lost their kids in court.
Yes, they
There were
did.
a lot of repercussions. And now, the worst that might happen is you might get laughed at or something by somebody, right? It's very different. Though, times are changing and not always for the
Yes, they
better.
are.
So I, worry that we might have more satanic panic soon. And I always felt like with some of the QAnon stuff, we were really bordering right up against it pretty hard.
It was the same story, just redirected to other people, right? It was still like
Yeah.
sacrificing children for immortal life. It was satanic. It was like all of these different things, right? Like it was the same story, just sort of updated, and they didn't use the word witches anymore or even Satanists necessarily, although that was a little bit in there. But yeah, it was very, very similar. And even now, as we see that the government is establishing a task force for anti Christian bias, right? That, I hope that no, I hope that young witches today never have to feel the way we did in the 90's necessarily, about being unsure about those things and really having larger systems and institutions. Like there weren't really any guardrails around discriminating against particularly such a small minority movement, faith, religion, whatever you want to call it, as witchcraft and Wicca. And I hope that people don't have to feel it quite the same way anymore. Although there's a part of me that is also saying, look, we made a lot of strides and gained a lot of rights, but it's also so new. Like we can't necessarily rest on our laurels, and I think that our world is sort of showing us that today. That like, oh, like this wasn't just done, right? We're not just we haven't just purely arrived. Like there is still a really important place for the modern practice and religion of Wicca and witchcraft in moving this culture forward and fighting against oppression. And I think it's more important than ever, really.
And I think we're at a huge disadvantage in that we are a very unorganized and
It's a huge
decentralized
disadvantage in a way
community.
that we were not in the 90's. We started to get organized in the 90's in a really big way. And, there's a number of things that happened, but that's part of one of the messages that I really hope to convey with this podcast is the power of getting together with other people and claiming your space and making things happen.
We're lucky we've had a few really great leaders over the years, like Selena Fox at
Yeah.
Circle Sanctuary. Getting pentagrams on gravestones for
Yeah.
service members was a huge win for our community and for the rights of witches and pagans everywhere. But I mean, there are a lot of people who don't even know that battle happened or
Right.
who Selena Fox is or what Circle Sanctuary does. And I think because of the witchcraft popul explosion in popularity too, there's almost like two different tracks of the witchcraft world.
Yeah.
There's the kind of we go to pagan festivals together and we listen to the same podcasts and we probably have all read the same books. And then there's this other group who have read a lot of different books and go to the wellness retreat for $2,000, who are following
Uh-huh.
influencers on Instagram and they're a part of our community, but they don't really interact with our community. It's
Yeah.
a very strange thing, and there hasn't been sort of that bridge to bring these two different sides together, which if bad things happen, isn't good for either side of us, right? Like we all need to
Correct.
be together as much as we can.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. And so just to wrap it up a little bit on a lighter note, Jason, what were some of your favorite pagan or witchy artists or music from the 90's or around the 90's?
Wow. So in the 90s, I was hugely into Led Zeppelin. That's like all I listened
Right.
to. It
Yep.
was classic rock. I started doing rituals for Jim Morrison of The Doors as the 20th century incarnation of Dionysus. Not my idea, but I ran with it and did it at a lot of festivals too. One of my favorite pagan leaning bands is an English band called XTC, and
Oh yeah.
their album Apple Venus Volume 1 has this beautiful song called Green Man on it, which is about the Green Man. And there's also Harvest Festival on there. There's something very witchy and pagan about XTC, and some of their older material also alludes to it. But they released Apple Venus Volume 1 and Volume 2 in the 90's, and those are just fantastic pagan albums, and I was hardcore obsessed with them for a while. Tori Amos is
Oh, of
another.
course.
I always
Yep.
thought Tori was a great gateway into witchcraft. Even if
Yep.
she was or wasn't a witchcraft, there was just something magical about that music. Also, Lorena McKennitt,
Oh, of
right?
course.
The Visit, The Mask in the Mirror. Her best
Oh,
albums were from that 90's period and were kind of the soundtrack for a lot of us
the soundtrack. That is
when we were doing
right.
witch
Yes.
ritual, right? Yeah. Like I'm gonna go listen to The Visit and I'm gonna feel super witchy and empowered. Yeah, Incubus Succubus was one of those bands
Oh,
from the
right.
90s
Yep.
too. Yeah, there were a lot of good things, but you had to look harder for it. It was harder to find purely pagan music too at the time
Mm-hmm.
because you had to either go to a witchcraft store that might have carried music, or you had to go to a festival where you might run into it. But today with the streaming services, it's easier than ever to
That's
find,
right.
Dave the Bard or Spiral Rhythm or whatever it is that you want to listen to. Yeah. The
That's
90s was
right.
harder. But yeah. Tori, XTC, Lorena. Yeah, those were my big three in the 90s for sure. And anything Celtic too. That was the era when everything that Wicca
Riverdance.
did, yeah, Riverdance, Lord of the Dance, anything that had like a that was a reel or a jig, we assumed
Wasn't
was
Celtic
crap.
Woman also in the 90s? I remember the Celtic
Yeah,
Woman commercials.
yeah,
Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, all of that stuff. It was a boon time for Celtic music.
Yeah, it was really exploding around that time. And you had
Yeah.
mentioned too about writing about Jim Morrison as Dionysus, and I think that that's a really apt comparison. And then a lot of people don't know that I think it was his first wife, Patricia, was also a practicing witch.
So the Patricia thing is interesting. Patricia Keneally was certainly a witch and a practicing witch, and she and Jim did have a hand fasting
Yeah.
ceremony. But most Jim scholars say that they only met maybe 4 or 5 times during
Oh,
his life. Like they did not spend a ton of time. And his common law wife was Pamela Corson. If you've ever seen
right.
the Doors movie,
Yeah.
that's the Meg Ryan character. Yeah. So there's like how big Patricia Keneally was in Jim's life is sort of an open question because a lot of biographers say not necessarily a huge part, including members of the Doors. And then if you had talked to Patricia Keneally, very different. But I think that was one thing about Jim. He had this presence with people, right? So they really
Mm.
obsessed about him, like the other members of the Doors did after his death. Patricia did. Yeah, there was just like a presence, that you still wanted to be close to, even though he was gone.
It just made a lot of sense to me that a modern Dionysus would marry a witch high priestess. At least as part of his story. I always thought that that was very fitting.
Oh yeah, I think it's cool, like cool as anything that he was there. And if you watch the Doors movie, Patricia Keneally is the high priestess in that scene where
Yes, she
he
is.
handfast Jim. So like she was a part of it, though they didn't listen to a lot of her instructions. And the Patricia Keneally character in that movie is actually three different women combined. Like he didn't drink blood with Patricia or anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, yeah, they
Yeah.
definitely Hollywoodified that. Well, Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking with us about your experience being a 90s witch and this wonderful book that you have coming out. And I believe it comes out May 8th, correct?
May 8th. Yep.
May 8th, and the book is High Priest, the father of Raymond Buckland, the father of American witchcraft. Well, I cannot wait to get this book. I love modern witch history, Jason. So even if you didn't want to write it at first, thank you for writing it. I'm sure it is going to be a gem in many people's libraries. And I'd love to have you back on the show sometime soon.
Excellent. Thank you. This has been a really great conversation. I love talking about the 90s. So this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.